I'm Ira Schiffer, Associate Chaplain of the College, and it's my pleasure to welcome mid-alumna Janine Zacharia, class of 1995, back to campus. Let me first extend thanks to Professor Ed Knox, Charlotte Tate, and Martha Baldwin of the Royalton Center for the continued support and encouragement in sponsoring these forums for serious, informed conversations on the complexities of the Middle East, and to Professor Robert Schein for the support of the Middle East Studies Program and the Akina Fund for Jewish Studies, and to Middlebury College Hillel for helping coordinate this event. A special thanks to catering for this perhaps first time kosher for Pesach, kosher for Passover luncheon at the Raj. The CSO has asked me to make the following announcement. Janine will also be participating in an alumni panel this afternoon for Career Services Communications Week at 4:30 p.m. in By Hall 220 for a career-related discussion. She's graciously offered to meet with students on an individual basis tomorrow morning at CSO. Please sign up on Mojo or contact CSO for sign-up information. Since 2005, Janine has been the diplomatic correspondent for Bloomberg News, covering the State Department and writing on a wide range of U.S. foreign policy issues. Janine is part of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's traveling press corps, appearing regularly on Bloomberg television, including a recent exclusive look at the rearming of Hezbollah in Lebanon and conducting the first interview with Admiral William Fallon, the new head of Central Command at CENTCOM HQ in Tampa. And on April 1st, Janine was on NBC's Chris Matthews show, No April Fool. For 5 years prior to taking the job at Bloomberg, Janine was the Washington bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post, Israel's English-language daily newspaper. She then reported on the Middle East from a U.S. perspective, including the Clinton administration's efforts to broker peace deals between Israel and her Arab neighbors, and the Bush administration's efforts to broker a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians, pursue regime change in Iraq, and flesh out a new approach to the Middle East. Janine spent the month of March 2003 on the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt in the Mediterranean Sea as one of 600 reporters embedded with the U.S. military. She filed regular dispatches, including for the New Republic magazine and MSNBC, and she became a regular contributor for both the weekly magazine and the cable news channel. Prior to taking up her posting in Washington with the Jerusalem Post, Janine worked for 5 years in Israel as a journalist, first for the biweekly magazine The Jerusalem Report, and then for the Reuters news agency. She received a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Literary Studies from Middlebury College and originally is from Long Island. Please join me in welcoming Janine Zacharia, who will give us a Mideast update from Washington from a reporter's notebook.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me in the back? All right. Just make a sign if you can't. All right. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Ira and Robert and everybody who had a hand in bringing me up here. It's always a pleasure to come to Middlebury and to take a break from the daily rigor of diplomatic reporting in Washington. I'm glad the snow didn't stop me from getting here. What I want to try to do today is talk about a lot of different things in a very short amount of time, and then create more of a discussion so I can get a sense of what you are most interested in. But just throw out some ideas about things that I've been reporting on, things that are happening in Washington, to use that as a basis for discussion. And there's about 6 things I want to touch on. Iraq, obviously, and we're going to devote most of the time to Iraq today, given that it's the 4th anniversary of the fall of Baghdad today. I think it's very apropos. Iran. We can talk about Iran. We can talk about the recent hostage crisis. Anything you have got, any interesting thoughts you have about that, the nuclear program, all kinds of things. Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israel-Lebanon war last summer, and the 2008 presidential campaign and how that relates to all this. And we're going to do all that in 20 minutes. Okay, so today's April 9th. It's the 4th anniversary of the fall of Baghdad. Tens of thousands of people are marching through the streets to mark Baghdad's fall, and unfortunately they are protesting the U.S. occupation there. Not a very happy scene in Baghdad today, but a moment, I think, to reflect on the situation there and also on broader Bush administration Middle East policy. Let's look at some poll numbers just to frame the discussion. A new poll out last week, actually I think it came out on what day is today? April 4th, maybe 5 days ago, put out by something called Public Agenda and Foreign Affairs Magazine, shows that the U.S. public is very anxious about the direction of U.S. foreign policy. And that anxiety is growing. About 2/3 say U.S. foreign policy is on the wrong track. With the situation in Iraq as a backdrop, a majority of Americans say they reject a military option for confronting Iran's nuclear program and are showing a stronger inclination towards diplomacy. Another factoid, 3 out of 4 say other countries need to do more to promote democracy at home in their own countries, not the U.S. This, of course, democracy promotion becoming a cornerstone of Bush administration's foreign policy after 9/11, and we can talk more about that later and where that stands. On Iraq, we see the U.S. is somewhat schizophrenic. 70% say they want either an immediate or a gradual withdrawal over the next 12 months of U.S. troops, with the majority of those saying a gradual withdrawal. At the same time, 60% say we have a moral obligation to the Iraqi people. So you've really got a conflict there between people wanting to pull out, but they say, hey, we got in there, we got to do something for them, we can't just leave. So you really see that schizophrenia there. And against this backdrop, the Bush administration, the Congress, and the 2008 presidential hopefuls are all mulling what to do in Iraq. In January, amid soaring violence and a recognition that the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki can't or won't take control of Shiite militias, President Bush shook up his team and announced a new strategy. What did he do first? First, he dumped Donald Rumsfeld, right? And he replaced him with Bob Gates, who was happily down in Texas, being a head of a university, having a nice quiet life, and the president called him up and said, I need you to come. Now, why did he pick Bob Gates? He was looking for somebody, a realist, somebody who would just go in there and analyze the situation and hopefully be able to turn it around. There was building frustration that the president hadn't dumped Donald Rumsfeld earlier, and so he turned to somebody with a pretty good reputation who he thought could get the job done. Next, he dumps General Abizaid, the head of Central Command. Central Command, of course, being the huge area of the entire Middle East, dumps General Abizaid and replaces him with Admiral William Fallon to take control of this large area. I have known Admiral Fallon for a very long time. As you heard, I was embedded on an aircraft carrier during the invasion, and when I got off the aircraft carrier, I got a call from a colleague, a friend of mine. She used to be the ambassador to Oman. She said, this Admiral Fallon really liked the dispatches you were filing. He was reading them. I said, well, I'm happy to meet him. Turns out his son had been flying sorties off the aircraft carrier that I was on, and so he took an interest in my reporting. He was a lower-ranking, albeit senior person in the Navy at the time. He then went on to become the head of U.S. Pacific Command, which commands 300,000 U.S. troops, and I traveled with him as the only reporter last May on a trip to China and really got to see him working up close. In fact, sat in meetings for the first time in my reporting life with a defense minister and things like that. And this guy, I went and interviewed him March 16th in Tampa as he took control. Again, a realist, somebody who wants to go in there and figure out what's going wrong, talk truth to power. This is a phrase you hear a lot about him, and see if they can turn things around. A few other personnel shifts, replacing General Casey with General Petraeus as the land commander, and doing all this at the same time that the president, in a very pivotal speech on January 10th, which I encourage you to take a look at again from time to time, that announcing a surge of 20,000 troops in Baghdad. Now, of course, you've read ad nauseum probably that the surge is not really a surge after all. It's basically done by delaying departures for people, speeding up deployments, extending National Guard rotations, taking quite a toll on the military. Nonetheless, focusing in this new strategy, quote unquote, on securing Baghdad, which the president saw as the most pivotal spot that they needed to get under control. And the president, despite the poll numbers that I've shared with you, is rhetorically and in principle sticking with the program, saying that, quote, this is something you hear very often in his speeches now, this is a war in which if we were to leave before the job is done, the enemy would follow us here. in that speech from January 10th, just to remind you where his thinking is, the consequences of failure are clear, he said. Radical Islamic extremists would grow in strength and gain new recruits. They would be in a better position to topple moderate governments, create chaos in the region, and use oil revenues to fund their ambitions. And he goes on and on. And he kicks this with, on September the 11th, we saw what a refuge for extremists on the other side of the world could bring to the streets of our own cities. For the safety of our people, America must succeed in Iraq. So he is quite committed, at least now, remains committed. At the same time, you have the Senate and the House just 2 weeks ago passing the appropriation supplemental bill to pump more money into Iraq, attaching a clause saying that there must be a timetable for withdrawal, saying, depending on which version, either that troops should or must be out by 2008, the majority of combat troops. The president, of course, threatening to veto this, and it looks like they might have some sort of a compromise that we can talk about a little later. But the point being that the president under a lot of pressure, both from Democrats and Republicans, in particular in the Senate, who are facing re-election next year, to do something in Iraq before they go to those elections. Now, you've got two real timelines bumping up against each other. You've got the real deadline that military experts say it will take 5 to 10 years to stabilize this country. 5 to 10 years. And then you've got the Washington, D.C. deadline, which is November 2008. Okay, less than, 18 months from now, 20 months from now? So when all these people are going to the elections. And with that in mind, we are seeing the earliest presidential campaign, and it's probably too early. I thought maybe it's too early for me to talk politics, but I'm sure everybody here is interested in politics, right? I mean, this is what's playing out right now. I mean, turn on your TVs, and everybody is focused on the horse race: Hillary, Obama, Edwards, Mrs. Edwards, everything. So this is what everybody's talking about. So I thought it would be useful just to reflect a little on where are all the candidates on this issue, right? I mean, because this is affecting the White House too, right? You've got this tension going on between everybody. I don't know, randomly I just started with the Republicans. Let's start with Giuliani. He's in a little trouble this week, but nonetheless, he's still a Republican hopeful. He says that setting an artificial timetable for withdrawal would be a terrible mistake, and it would embolden our enemies. He sees Iraq as one front in the larger war on terror, and failure there would lead to a broader and bloodier regional conflict in the near future. He's sort of in line with Bush there, right? I mean, that's similar to what Bush is saying. John McCain. I recommend that you look at an op-ed that he had in the Washington Post yesterday. You may not have to. Just turn on your TV on Wednesday. He's giving a major address on Wednesday. He's got a problem. John McCain's got a problem. The country is done with this war, and he is saying we have to remain committed. Not only remain committed, he has always said that we need to infuse more troops. Why did he oppose a surge of 20,000 troops when the president announced it in January? Because he said we needed 100,000 more, which we didn't have, right? So he just came back from his fifth trip to Iraq a couple days ago. He said that there were reasons for cautious optimism. He talked about how he saw Iraqi and American forces working together. And in this op-ed yesterday, the operative phrase was, we have a long, tough road in Iraq. Now, whether or not he can sway the country to come around to his point of view on that remains to be seen, but he's definitely going to have his own tough slog persuading people to be with him if you look at the polls. John Edwards. On February 2nd, there was the Democratic National Committee Washington, Winter Conference, and John Edwards, while he remains the third place candidate for all intents and purposes right now, got the widest, most positive applause and response for this. It is a betrayal, he said, for this president to send more troops into harm's way when we know it will not succeed in bringing stability to the region. John Edwards, of course, back in November 2005, was one of with his presidential run in mind, I think, penned an op-ed in the Washington Post that started, "I was wrong." And he took responsibility for the Senate vote he cast in 2002 endorsing the war. So it's very clear that John Edwards intends, if he was elected, to reduce the American presence, although he doesn't say at what pace. Hillary Clinton. If you want to know where she is on Iraq, call up the New York Times interview with her from March 14th. This was her most expansive, I would say, lengthy discussion of Iraq, her fullest reflection, at least to date. She endorses engagement with Iran and Syria. That's drawing from the report that the James Baker Commission put out in December. She says that the surge in 20,000 in Baghdad, could simply move the violence to other places like a whack-a-mole, she says. Okay, so if we get Baghdad under control, then the violence will go elsewhere. But she also sees success in Iraq, like McCain, like Bush, like probably everybody, as integral to U.S. national security interests. And she says you have the potential, if you pull out precipitously, for creating a breeding ground for insurgents, quote, right in the heart of the oil region. It is directly in opposition to our interests. So, but what she recommends is sort of repositioning U.S. troops, taking them out of the urban areas and putting them sort of at the gates to where the trouble is. At least that's where she is right now. And so that's sort of, and then of course there's Obama. And he gave his pivotal remarks to the Council on Foreign Relations in Chicago back in November 2005, where he was sharply critical of the administration, talking about needing to manage our exit in a responsible way, and maybe a time frame for a phased withdrawal, but there isn't a lot of meat on his position right now. Now, what's really happening? What is the administration really thinking? It seems to me that the best I can deduce is that they know that the country is not going to stick with it much longer. Admiral Fallon has said this in the week since he took over on March 16th. But the president doesn't want Congress telling him what to do. You've got a real clash between the traditional legislative branch and the executive branch. He doesn't want them putting anything in the legislation. I think he'd be happier sort of just being able to give this surge another 6 months and then reassess and then see how they might be able to start drawing down ahead of the 2008 election. But I think that realistically, the president also understands that one way or the other, this is not going to be solved by the time we have elections in November 2008, and that the next president is really going to have to be the one to figure out how to get us out of Iraq. Now, with Iraq sucking the life force out of most of the administration's foreign policy priorities, there is, however, a second most pressing Iran policy challenge, and that's namely Iran. I want to talk about what I think is a big, crazy myth out there. We're not going to war with Iran. Okay? Unless there's something that really unexpected happens and trigger, there's nobody sitting in Washington right now saying, okay, how can we go to war with Iran? And there might be people who ideologically would like to see Ahmadinejad go off into the wasteland and disappear. There might be people who sat angry during the British hostage crisis and couldn't believe that we weren't, sticking it to them. But we are so overextended in Iraq right now that nobody could contemplate opening up that front. That's not to say that military planners aren't obviously doing the responsible thing, doing their job, coming up with possible strike options and things like that, but there's certainly no appetite for that right now. And the U.S. concerns vis-a-vis Iran are in two baskets: Iranian meddling in Iraq and Iran's nuclear program. And what the Bush administration has decided after about, a year and a half of sort of flailing around on this, is that it's okay to talk to Iran about Iraq. But it's not okay to talk to them directly about their nuclear program unless they freeze uranium enrichment. And today, of all days, they signaled that they really had no plans to do that. Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad announced about an hour or two ago that Iran has begun industrial-scale nuclear fuel production, and he said that they're entering mass production of centrifuges, starting to launch industrial-scale enrichment, coming on the heels just 2 days after the hostages. We got to talk about the hostages, which was just like this crazy spectacle. But clearly saying to the West, don't mess with us. Don't mess with us. Here we are. We took these guys hostage. We decided when we were going to release them. We gave them the suits. We sent them home as a present. We used the Prophet Muhammad's birthday to climb down the tree, but we can do what we want in the Persian Gulf. And moreover, in case you were thinking about passing more sanctions on us at the UN, we're going to announce that we're enriching more and creating more centrifuges on a mass scale. Oh boy. So I'm not in Washington today, but they're not going to be happy with this probably. So the question we have to think about also now is after this, this whole thing was resolved peacefully, obviously. I think that the Iranians realized after 13 days they got as much out of it as they could. But how will this impact the willingness of the Security Council to continue to be tough with Iran? I don't think it will sway them from, maybe implementing another tranche of sanctions. But the only sanction, and think about this when you're reading the papers about sanctions, they passed more sanctions. The only sanction that will matter is the oil sanction, the energy sanction. And how are you going to get an energy sanction? I'm just throwing it out there. When Iran and China, one of the permanent members of the Security Council, have signed a deal on Chinese investment in Iran's oil fields and long-term sale of Iranian natural gas that would be worth up to $200 billion. I don't know, given China's needs. This is a real problem. Now, the Bush administration, you talk to senior officials that I interview quite regularly, they're happy with moderate steps that Europeans are agreeing to, do less business and things like this. But this is a really tough, long diplomatic slog, to use that word slog again. I don't know why I keep using it, but there's a lot of slogging going on right now. Now, just over the border from Iran, I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but I wanted to remind everybody about another country called Afghanistan, where we had some bad news overnight with roadside bombs in southern Afghanistan killing 7 NATO soldiers yesterday. This is very bad. This is very bad here, what's going on in Afghanistan, because you've got really the shift, everything's shifted to Iraq. The U.S., the Bush administration is begging NATO, please do more in Afghanistan. We just don't have it. We can't do it. Please do more. NATO's saying, we don't want to do combat. We don't want to do combat with Taliban. No. We're going to be peacekeepers. We don't want to do combat. And the U.S. is saying, please, and this is what you have going into what is an expected Taliban spring offensive. This is caught up with opium. This is caught up with President Karzai not being strong enough. This could be a real flashpoint this summer, and I'm just, making everybody aware that it's not, Afghanistan is not as far from a success yet. I guess that's stating the obvious. I don't know, that was pretty silly. But let's turn now to Israel. Now, you see, we've got Iraq, and we got Iran, and we got this Afghanistan thing, and then you've got Israel. And even though Condoleezza Rice, and I've gone with her, has traveled, once every 4 weeks over the past 3 or 4 months to Jerusalem and Ramallah, I would argue that this is still not a foreign policy priority for them. If they could get, them being the Bush administration, obviously, if they could get something rolling on this, I think they'd be happy, but it's not clear to me that the president is willing to devote time to this issue the way, for example, that President Clinton did. Remember, though, that President Clinton only became involved deeply in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process late in his second term as well. So I'm not saying that it's not possible, but of course you have a very different dynamic going on than you did then. Then you had Yasser Arafat, who had been the leader of the Palestinian people for decades. You had Ehud Barak, who was still popular at the time, at least going into Camp David. You had people who had been working this issue, like Dennis Ross, for years. They had the peace plan ready. It was late. It was late in the game, and we're not going to get into a revision of 2000 Camp David and what happened. There's been books written on this. But compare that with what Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration faces now. Hamas in the government with Fatah. You've got Hamas, of course, being a U.S.-designated terrorist organization, so the U.S. cannot even engage really fully with this government. They're trying to work with it piecemeal. We'll work with Abbas, but we're not going to work with Hamas, and it's tough. President Abbas is weak, and even weaker, I would argue, but I yield to Timmy Meyer, is Prime Minister Olmert, who I think ever since the Lebanon war last summer has not been able to really regain his political footing, if he ever had it in the first place, since Ariel Sharon took sick 2 years ago now, or a year ago. 2 years ago. So, year and a half. He's been in a coma for a long time. Now, okay, but just to see, what is Condi Rice trying to do? She goes on the road and she talks about, we have to articulate a political horizon for the Palestinians. Now, this is a euphemism for outlining what a Palestinian state would look like. Basically, that's what she means. She likes this phrase, political horizon. And Olmert is saying, no, we're not doing anything right now. Why are we going to do this right now? They just brought Hamas into the government. They're holding our soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was kidnapped June. And thank God she's here. And then, they're holding it. What am I going to talk about? I'm not going to talk about a political horizon, which is the future of Jerusalem, Palestinian state borders, refugees. I'm not going to talk about this with you. So she goes there, and she doesn't really get much done, but she's, at least trying to facilitate a dialogue. Now, how can she possibly think in this environment that she's got a chance? It brings me back to Iran. This is the way Condi Rice sees it right now. Iran is the big growing enemy. Who's scared of Iran? Who doesn't like Iran? The Israelis and the Arab states. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, they're all afraid of Iran, Shiite dominance. They don't like it. Maybe there's a way to link them together. And Dennis Ross, the former Mideast peace negotiator, has a very good article about this in the New Republic online today. You could see it, where he argues that that's great. That's great that you have a common interest between Israel and the Arabs vis-a-vis Iran, but it's not enough to get the peace process going. And frankly, the Arabs, after witnessing the peace process of the 90s, don't want a gradual peace process. They just want the deal. They want the U.S. to come and say, look, Omer, this is what you got to do. And there's certainly no political will for that in Washington. And just lastly, before we talk about the questions, I just wanted to, I made reference to the Israel-Lebanon war. I was up there about a month ago on the Israeli border. Now, I was only on the Israeli side just because I had limited time and this is where I was. But the reason I went up there was because in Israel, I hear a lot of people talking about, they say Bakaitz, Od Milchama Bakaitz, another war in the summer. Now, this just might be, everybody imagining things, and I don't know, this is what they think, there'll be another war in the summer. But I want to say, why are they saying that? And they're saying it because even though there's, they stopped the war in August, but Hezbollah is steadily rearming. And, you don't have to believe the Israelis. You listen to Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah himself. The UN is saying, we're not stopping it. That's not our mandate. We're just supposed to, keep the buffer zone. I always do this when I come here. I go like this, and I think you know what I'm talking about. But this is actually the border zone between Israel and Lebanon where the UN UNIFIL is deployed. Just north of there, just north of the Litani River, weapons are coming across the Syrian border still. Syria, I didn't get to Syria. But so anyway, there's a very precarious situation there that could explode at any moment. And this was not chronological, but I thought it was worth just discussing for a moment, if we're talking politics and foreign policy, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Syria. I don't know if people followed that at all up here. She went to Syria, and the president said it was counterproductive. She got heavily criticized for it. And again, you saw this tension, and with this I'll wrap, that do we engage? Does the United States engage or not engage with its enemies? And this is, should they talk to Syria and Iran or not? And this is really the crux of the debate in Washington right now. We can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you're interested, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks a lot. Okay. And I'm sorry if I talk quickly. I always say I talk too quickly and too much information, talk slower, I don't know.
Janine is going to field her own questions and giving priority to students. And now I want to thank you for your rapid-fire presentation.
All right. I explained everything. Come on, there's no students want to ask me a question? Yeah, go ahead. And I'll repeat the questions in case you can't hear them.
I have a question about how the war is being reported on. And this isn't very intelligently phrased, but I want your opinion as a reporter. I think a lot of us kind of only read the New York Times, especially up here. It's really easily accessible online.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's and I don't know if this is right or not, but it seems like there's the New York Times, everyone knows has liberal bias, but it slips into all of their objective reporting. And maybe I'm perceiving that incorrectly, but it really seems like the headlines they choose and the way they report, it's just they just keep reiterating that this is one big failure after another, like the whole Bush administration. Is that bad for reporting? It seems like they're being as unobjective as say Fox is, or I don't know. We like to criticize up here on the left, the right media, but it seems like the New York Times is just as bad. Is that justified, or do they have a slant, and is it coming through in where it shouldn't be?
Does everybody hear that? Mm-hmm. All right. Look, there's a real problem with reporting on Iraq right now. You're right to feel it. You're right to zoom in on it. You cannot go outside the green zone. Okay, the green zone being, the cloistered, the area of Baghdad that they've sealed off for the U.S. Embassy without really putting your life at risk. So it's very hard to report. When you put on your TV and you're seeing, what's his name with the nose on CNN, the good-looking guy, they've got their Baghdad reporter. He's in the green zone. It's very hard to go out. It's very hard to go out and about. Like, I'm contemplating a trip right now to go out with what are known as provisional reconstruction teams, which are out in the field. And I'm like, do I really want to do this? I mean, you got to really plan security-wise. And so I think that whenever I get the media bias question, I think that there's a lot of bad news in Iraq right now. There's a lot of bad news. You can't not report that 138 people got blown up in a market or whatever. You have to assess as honestly as you can whether this surge is having an impact or not. And I think actually if you read it over time, it's not all negative. Sometimes they'll say, well, they're showing that it's actually cut down on Shiite Sunni murders, but car bombs are up. And you have a mixed picture, so it's hard to just say everything's great. Now, could they do more stories about the schools that are being built and all these things like the president wants everybody to do? Yeah, probably. But when you have a situation which is so overwhelmingly spinning out of control, it's generally going to seem like the reporting is negative. Now, then I say to you, I throw out to you, you as a smart Middlebury student have to read a variety of sources. You have to read the New York Times. Don't only read the New York Times because it's easy to get on the internet. You've got to read different things. Read media from the region. Read different things that are going on, and then listen to what policymakers are saying and make your own judgment that way. But don't just rely on New York Times or Fox, because then you don't know. Then you get only 1%. You do only get one perspective, I'd say. But I don't think there's a calculated anti-Bush media campaign in the reported stories. I think the opinion page is something totally different, and you're going to get a left-leaning opinion page on the New York Times. Yeah.
I'd like to hear your opinion about the Bush administration's foreign policy objective of creating more democracies in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Basically, with what happened when we supported elections in Palestinian territories, we got Hamas, which is obviously not a pro-U.S. Government. So do you think that by including governments or groups like Hamas or groups like Hezbollah in the political process that they become, maybe there's a chance that they become more moderate and therefore that's a good thing, or that we should not engage them because we consider them terrorist organizations?
Did everybody hear that? This whole question is, I'll announce it again. We supported democracy promotion. We got Hamas and the Palestinian government. Is the idea that by incorporating them into the political system that they'll become more moderate? And that's sort of the general thrust of the question. Well, that's what they're hoping. That's what they're hoping. The people who have pushed this. Now the Palestinian elections, Condoleezza Rice herself said, they were caught by surprise. They really thought, they pushed President Abbas to hold those elections in January 2005. Abbas was saying, we're not ready. Fatah's not ready. We're not ready for the election. Don't make us do it right now. And the administration's like, we're doing this. We're doing it. And that's what they got. And when they said they were surprised, I said, you were surprised? What do you mean you were surprised? You didn't look at the polls. You were surprised, but they were surprised. And I think probably in retrospect, they had hoped that they had held off a little bit longer. But now that this is the reality that they face, they are hoping that Hamas could be co-opted and become more moderate and be brought into the political system like Fatah was. Remember, the PLO, nobody was negotiating with them either when they were, hijacking planes and carrying out, and then they became Israel's political partner, negotiating partner. So I think that that's the long-term goal. And the same goes for Lebanon, where Hezbollah is now they withdrew from the cabinet, but they were in the cabinet, hoping that by bringing them into the political scene that they would become more moderate. We haven't seen this yet, though, and this might be a long-term prospect. Now, if you remember, as I made reference in my remarks, after 9/11, they got together and they said, we need a new approach to the Middle East. For 60 years, we've been supporting autocracy, and this has served to breed Islamic fundamentalism, and we need to create democracies now. Democracies are our friends. That's the way the script went. This is that script right now. It's not something that's a priority any longer. You still have, for example, Elliot Abrams, who's the National Security Council Middle East point man, who happens to be the Middle East guy, and he also holds the democracy promotion chair at the White House, too. So I'm not saying it's totally delinked, but it's certainly not the thrust. There's a recognition, there's a realism that we need to work with the Saudis, that we need to do all these things. Now, when the Saudis brokered this coalition government, and if no one knows what I'm talking about, just say I don't know what you're talking about, and I'll back up. But the Saudis a few weeks ago brokered this coalition government between Hamas and Fatah. The White House was not happy about this, But the Saudis did it, and that was their priority, to create I don't know how to say it, shalom bayit, like to create peace at home among the Palestinians first, because they were like killing each other, remember? So the Saudis were like, oh God, we got to do this. And whether or not that actually emerges, as you say, is yet to be seen, I would say. Yeah?
I'm curious, right after 9/11 and kind of before really Iraq became the focus of the Middle East, when we were looking more at kind of the root causes of Islamic extremism, the direction seemed to be, the heart of this problem is the Palestinian, Israeli conflict.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the major driving forces behind this. To what extent do you think that now much of what's driving Islamic extremism is no longer, or is still the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and has shifted more to, what's happening in Iraq, and what is serving as kind of the main driving force, building Al-Qaeda, building terrorism cells around? I mean, what is your feeling in that?
Yeah, I think what's driving Islamic fundamentalism is, a combination of things. But there was always this argument, too, about, in the run-up to the war, like, is the road to peace in the Middle East through Jerusalem or Baghdad? And you had people sort of resisting the idea that you had to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first. There's no doubt that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict feeds it. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, you just have to turn on Al Jazeera or one of these networks, and it's going to get people riled up. It's going to get people riled up. It's certainly the Israel-Lebanon war didn't help. I think anything that shows, Israel or the U.S. harming Muslims and that being portrayed is going to fuel this. Iraq, huge. I mean, it's huge. Not only Iraq, everything that's come out of Iraq, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, these things resonate. And you have just sort of an overwhelming sweeping of anti-Western feeling that I don't think anybody has really figured out how to successfully counter. One of the biggest failures, I think, of the Bush administration so far has been their public diplomacy effort, for example. They really made a big deal, for example, when President Bush announced that he was appointing Karen Hughes to be his public diplomacy chief. He thought that she got him elected. And she knew the politics of Texas and Iowa, and she didn't know anything about the Middle East. I mean, she was not really a Middle East. You needed people who would be able to sort of read the Arab media, talk to people in the madrasas, figure out, and listen, public diplomacy is not going to solve it. It's going to have to be public diplomacy and policy, and you might never solve it. But I don't know how to answer your question in sort of which is fueling it more. I think it's a combination of everything. So I'm sorry if that sounds like I'm punting, but somebody else. Yeah, go ahead.
If you've kind of gotten a sense of their desired regional strategy for Syria, Israel, Iran?
Well, the Democrats, honestly, they haven't really started fleshing this out too much yet. Everything's been so focused on Iraq, and I expect that you will, in the coming months, if not sooner, see broad foreign policy speeches. But the Democrats, for sure, the big three, Obama, Hillary, and Edwards, are focusing on this engagement. You hear engagement, let's engage. Iran, Syria, let's engage. That's sort of their buzzword. And that's not to say that McCain or Giuliani wouldn't engage, but I haven't heard each of them really sketch out their broad foreign policy position. I think that there's a recognition. I mean, I don't see anybody deviating and being anti-Israel, for example, or saying that now's the time to put pressure on Ehud Olmert to do a final peace deal. I think that they're going to be very measured, especially right now in the run-up. They're trying to gain support, financial support, and very measured on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, say the stock phrases. Now, Hillary has sort of a little bit of a problem with this. I mean, she, over the years, as First Lady, got into hot water with the American Jewish community and the Palestinian community and everything. So she's got to sort of sort out herself there. But this sort of gets back to another talk that I used to give about the American Jewish vote and where will people land this year, I think is very interesting. I don't know. So, go ahead.
We were hearing for a while about how maybe the administration should engage countries like Iran and Syria to help with Iraq, and now we're hearing rumors about how Iran is helping to fund terrorism in Iraq. And can you say a little bit about maybe what you think the administration should be doing with those surrounding countries in terms of Iraq?
Yeah, well, I can't tell you what I think they should be doing, but I can tell you what people think they should be doing. This whole question of whether to engage Iran in Syria. As I said, this is really everybody talking about this. I wake up in the morning, this is what I'm writing about and talking about. And on March 10th, there was a conference in Baghdad attended by the now previous U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Zalmay Khalilzad. He's going to replace John Bolton at the UN. Where he, and it was ridiculous. I mean, the questioning, we did a conference call with him that Saturday, I remember, and it was like, my colleagues and I were asking him, okay, well, did you pour the orange juice for the Iranian, or did he pour the orange juice for you? We heard you drank orange juice together, like, trying to get a sense of, like, what kind of engagement did they have, because it would be such a big step. After all, the U.S. and Iran have had no relations for 27 years. No relations for 27 years. And think about what's going on. I mean, we rely on the Swiss, we rely on these other people. We're trying to figure out what's going on with Iran's nuclear program, whether President Ahmadinejad is vulnerable, what's going on, is his rhetoric working? We don't know. I mean, the U.S. doesn't really know. And they admit this. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was, just to digress for a moment, Nick Burns, who's the number 3 policy person at the State Department, was giving testimony at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about 2 weeks ago. And someone, I think maybe Hagel or somebody asked him, like, what do we know? He's like, we know very little. We rely on others. That's not a good position to be in right now when you're trying to sort out what's going on in Iran. But nonetheless, this is the policy. And so they formed this compromise in their mind. It's okay to talk to Iran about sorting things out in Iraq. Because the U.S. is saying to them, look, you're supplying these improvised explosive devices. You are undermining the success of this government. You've got to stop it. Now, what's Iran going to say to that? Yeah, okay, fine. What's our leverage over them right now? And I don't know if anybody's really figured out what the or else would be. So they at least air the complaints to the Iranians and then see what happens. Now, the Iranians want a broader dialogue. They want to talk. They want to talk about the nuclear. Okay, we'll talk. We want to talk about Iraq. We'll talk about the nuclear program too. And Condoleezza Rice says, I won't talk to you about the nuclear program until you freeze uranium enrichment. So they're all they're talking past each other. So the problem is there any point in talking to people who are undermining your policies in Iraq? That's the question. Now, a lot of people, like James Baker, George Bush I first advisor, said yes in his report in December. Yes, you must talk to them. These are the guys that are meddling. You can't pick who you do diplomacy with. You got to talk to them. There are things you can offer them. And then there are people in the Bush administration who say, no, there's no reason to talk to them. They're undermining our interests. Why should we talk to them? We have to be tough with them. And I don't know the answer. I don't know how this is going to play out. I know that there's going to be another conference of Iraq's neighbors. Probably they're going to announce it this week. Probably going to be May 3rd or 4th in Egypt. Rice will go to that. And it will be the first time that she and the Iranian foreign minister sort of are in the same room at that level, the UN aside, where they sometimes pass each other, where they're actually going to have an opportunity to talk. So I'd say that the administration's position is maturing, albeit slowly, in the direction of trying to talk to them, but they're not there yet. They're not sold on the idea. So, David Rosenberg. Hi.
Thanks for all of that. I'm still digesting it.
And your matzah and tuna, too.
There's something very puzzling going on in U.S.-Iranian relations. And by the way, we're having a talk here tomorrow night with some of our students from Iran,
oh, fantastic,
and Afghanistan, and others in the region, hear about what's going on, what's posturing and what's more realistic, and that may help enlighten us a little bit more. My curiosity was piqued by the article by Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker 3 weeks ago, talking, I think it was called Redirection.
right.
And in brief, his argument then, as you may already know, was that the Saudi government is pressuring the White House a lot to somehow restrain Iranian actions supporting various Shiite militias in Iraq, as well as in Syria, and in Lebanon. And he saw this as a point of issue. And then that led to some reactions, which I thought you more or less dismissed or downplayed as not very serious.
Mm-hmm.
But as you should know, there are 2 aircraft carrier battle groups from the U.S. in that region specifically now to send a message to Iran. That's not minor. That's a major issue, I should think. And I believe U.S. forces also seized some Iranian so-called diplomats,
Right.
or quasi-diplomats, or diplomats-to-be, in Iraq. And some of them were released.
All right, let me clarify.
Extensive protest, others were not. that may have tripped off their seizing of these British sailors who wandered errantly into Iranian waters. So underneath the headlines, underneath the surface, there's a lot of jostling and elbows and contentious policy, moves going on. I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments about those.
Okay, well, Seymour Hersh, look, the thing about the Saudis is sort of what I was referring to, this idea that, okay, we're all united in this will to oppose this Shiite crescent that's going from Tehran to Beirut, right? So we're all united, we're all going to work on it. But it's been the Saudis. It was the Saudis who went to Beirut and talked to Hezbollah and was like, stop it. Stop it, calm down. And then, Fouad Senghor, the prime minister of Lebanon, was about to be toppled about 6 weeks ago, and then suddenly he's not toppled. And I think I would argue, the Saudi visit there had a large impact from what I'm told. That said, yes, you have 2 aircraft carrier groups in the Persian Gulf. You've always had one there for like 60 years. You've had one. And you send another one over, you send a signal. Like, we're here, we're securing this. This is not your lake. This is not an Iranian lake. This is a major waterway. Here we are. And you are sending a signal with your presence there. They carried out these exercises, these flight exercises off the Eisenhower. I don't remember both of them, I think, were starting to work together during the hostage crisis. Those were previously scheduled exercises. But I talked to a senior military official who said, we're definitely, by continuing and going on with these exercises in the midst of this crisis with the British, we're sending a signal like, here we are. So maybe the U.S. didn't need to say anything during the crisis. They said it through actions, like you said, like, we are here, we have superior power to you, and we have the capabilities still. That's different from the U.S. really plotting, as Seymour Hersh argued, with Israel and in the war and this major thing that they're going to do. That was an unintentional war. In the Israel-Lebanon war. I think Omer woke up the next day and said, oh my God, I can't believe we're in a war. Honestly, I really do. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, right? But things just sort of, an incident, the kidnapping of the Israeli soldiers triggered that war, I would argue, more than, and then maybe they saw an opportunity to maybe get rid of Hezbollah, but it was after the fact. It wasn't designed that way. And I think that sometimes people think that there's this mass plan that's going on, and a lot of what's happening in U.S. foreign policy right now, I think, is reactive and haphazard. Sadly, the thing with the diplomat and the 5, I tried to figure this out last week. Apparently, there was one Iranian diplomat that was kidnapped. I don't know the Iraqis or who, the U.S. So they kidnapped him, and then that they released him the day before Ahmadinejad announced he was going to release them for Easter and the Prophet's birthday as a gift to the British people. Now, was there a deal there? I don't think there was a deal. There might have been I don't know, though, but no one really knows if there was a deal. The British are denying there was a deal. The U.S. is denying there was a deal. Separately, you have 5 Iranian, what the U.S. are calling security prisoners, being held in detention by the multinational forces somewhere in Iraq, who they accuse of plotting to blow up U.S. soldiers and smuggling in these improvised explosive devices, which now have a more sophisticated acronym. I can't remember right now. But the point is, and there was a lot of speculation during the 13 days of the hostage crisis that they were going to be traded, and they weren't. And they weren't traded. And the U.S., I was at a dinner the other night with a very senior White House official who said, I said, you know what, I was under a lot of pressure from my editors to figure out whether you were going to trade these guys. He's like, we weren't going to trade them. We were basically letting Tony Blair do everything. Bush didn't speak about it, did not mention the words Iran, British hostages for the first, I think, 11 days of this. They just wanted the Brits to handle it. And it worked. It worked, actually. But so I don't know, David, to answer your question. I think you're right. I think it's mixed. I don't think it's clear which way they're going. Like I said, sometimes we're negotiating with them, sometimes we're not. We're sending messages with the aircraft carriers, but I would argue, and people could disagree with me, that there is no appetite or will or ability to mount a offensive against Iran right now.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question?
Yes.
Is it possible that the Pacific Command and their concern about maintaining the flow of oil have a different agenda and different priorities than the White House that's looking at their domestic political?
What do you mean the Pacific? You mean Fallon? You mean
yes.
Fallon, okay, so they appoint this first Navy CENTCOM chief ever as the head of Central Command, right? They pick a Navy guy, so everybody says, oh, they pick a Navy guy. What they're really concerned about is Iran and the Persian Gulf. No doubt that's an aspect of it, but I mean, I've interviewed Fallon, I've talked to him, like, believe me, the fact that they're appointing him is not a sign that we're going to go to war with Iran. I think that they are concerned about the Strait of Hormuz, there's no doubt about it. The rules of engagement are fuzzy. What you saw, your takeaway from this British hostage crisis thing should be that everybody's vulnerable. Okay, but from researching this and talking to people, there's pretty good rules of engagement between the U.S. and the Iranian navies, but then you've got the Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who are the ones who came up on the little boat and took them. They operate under a separate chain of command, and we don't have any rules of engagement with them. So there could be more problems along those lines, yeah. Timmy Meyer.
I actually want to talk a little bit about the role of the Saudis.
Yeah.
It looks to me that if we look at the map of the Middle East and at sort of the power structure of the Middle East, the Saudis seem the strongest of all the countries in the region. They're brokering, there is some kind of a peace plan for Israelis and the Palestinians, that is the Saudis. They're engaged in Lebanon. They are engaged with the Palestinians. They're becoming, and the fact that they've always been such a strong ally of the United States, they're becoming this really important player, which they haven't been for many years. Do you think that part of this has to do with the U.S. engagement in Iraq?
Because of that they've had to step up.
Yeah, they have to step up.
I think it's an interesting theory. I think that the Saudis see that the U.S. is overwhelmed, that they see that much of what they anticipated would happen has happened, and that they do see an opportunity as well as an obligation to fill this role as chief mediator there. I think that's probably right.
Right. So then the second step is so the United States wants to be able to continue to control what's going on in the Middle East. The United States is becoming marginal
Right.
region for everybody.
This is a growing thesis that you hear a lot.
Right. And Israel has relationship now with China, and there are all the map is changing. The political map of the Middle East is changing. What do you think will happen? Will the United States continue to support Saudi militarily? Will they continue to support Israel? I mean, once we have that kind of a change and the United States becoming more marginal, how is the United States going to come back and assert its
I don't know, it's so far off to me. It's so far. I don't know if they're worried about this right now. I don't know if they're. I don't know. Richard Haas, for the council, he wrote this whole paper about recently, a big thing in foreign affairs about the ebbing of U.S. influence in the Middle East. They got to figure out what they're going to do tomorrow with, we're talking. That's like the fourth quarter. We're like in the pregame show here. We're like still trying to figure out how we're going to who we're going to put on the field. Like they can't even the broader. What you're talking about is like planning that would be done in policy planning over a cup of tea with the at the State Department, and they're really trying to figure out how do we figure out this war and stop people from getting blown up. So I think that if the Saudis are stepping up and calming things in Lebanon, they're saying, oh, thank God, at least they can do something there. At least somebody's got some power who's our friend. You know what I mean? They don't mind outsourcing it. Now the Palestinian issue is trickier, right? The Palestinian issue is trickier. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, for example, on when Olmert came out a couple weeks ago and endorsed the Saudi peace plan, that this was the U.S. saying to Olmert, it would be nice if you could say a few things about the Saudi peace plan. I can't prove it. I'm sure it happened, though. I have no doubt. And they're trying to rally some consensus. What did she do on the last trip? She was going, this was 2 weeks ago, she being Rice, obviously, to try and get the Arab states to advance a key aspect of the Saudi peace plan. What's the Saudi peace plan? Saudi peace plan is land for peace, basically, between Israel and the Palestinians, along with normalization of ties between the Arab states and Israel, which they haven't had, right, since 1948. She wants them to kick that part up. Start normalizing earlier as an incentive for the Israelis to negotiate. The Arabs were like, no way, we're not going to do that. Are you crazy? We're not doing that. So, they're playing this game of chicken with the Saudis and the U.S., trying to work together, but their interests are not always in line, is my point. But broadly, they need the Saudis right now. The U.S. needs anybody they can find. They need the Saudis. One player who I didn't mention at all, who's been a little bit marginalized, has been Egypt. I mean, the Saudis have largely, as you rightly identify, I think, outpaced the Egypt. What have the Egyptians done for us lately? I mean, honestly, they can't get Corporal Gilad Shalit out of the Gaza Strip, which is Egyptian realm of influence. They can't get that done. If I was a Bush administration official, I'd be like, I'm going to the Saudis then, you know? So, I mean, they haven't been able to do it either, but at the same time, the Egyptians are, I mean, the whole, we did democracy issue with Egypt, we could do a whole thing on that. That's just withering right now. So, go ahead, yeah, sorry.
Is it more a civil war type situation between Sunnis and Shia that we've created and we're caught in the crossfire right now, or is it more an anti-U.S. sentiment?
I think it's both. Look, I'm not on the ground. I haven't been there in like 8 months, and I haven't traveled widely in Iraq, you know. So I don't like being, is there a civil war or not? But it definitely looks like you have both. You have anti-U.S. Al-Qaeda elements doing that, but more broadly, you've got this Sunni-Shia clash, which has just been unearthed, and no one knows how to put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, these horrible stories about, like, the rampages of the Shiite militia and the Sunni militia, and where's Muqtada al-Sadr, and, like, trying to sort this all out. The key here, you never even hear his name anymore, is Prime Minister Maliki, right, who's Shia, and whether or not he can actually clamp down on these Shiite militia, empower Sunnis more. There are things on the margins that could maybe make this better. Things like the oil law, which they can't seem to just nail, which would make resources flow into Sunni areas and empower sheikhs and do these things. They're having trouble getting this all together. But yeah, you are looking at a civil war, and you've got U.S. policymakers saying, Jesus, we don't want to put our soldiers in the middle of this. We've got to pull them back at least. But then what do? Just let them kill each other? So I think there is aspects of both. Now, the thing is about the anti-U.S. occupation, those are the militants who are saying that. But talk to the Iraqis. They think they want the U.S. troops to leave? I'm sure they don't. I think it's going to be much, they're scared to death about how much worse it would be if you didn't have 130,000 U.S. troops there. So there again you have a schizophrenia, I think. Popular to say, get the U.S. out, but also, oh my God, we need them. So that's the tension, I think. Oh, you have follow-up? We're almost out of time. What should I do? Okay, so we'll go here and then here. Go ahead.
Back to Iran.
Yeah.
The emergency supplement bill that passed in the House recently originally contained a provision prohibiting Bush from attacking Iran without consulting Congress, and that provision was removed.
Yeah.
It sounded as if a lot of people thought that had to do with pressure on Nancy Pelosi by AIPAC. So, what's the situation?
Okay, the question was, yes, okay. And what, sorry?
How significant is it?
Yeah, this was a good question. I forgot to mention this. The question was about, in the appropriations bill, whatever you want to call it, negotiations, there was originally a provision in the House that would prohibit Bush from going to war against Iran without consulting with Congress. And it was yanked, and Pelosi, if I recall, was promised to have a full-scale debate in the House about this issue, about whether that would be necessary in the future. That's the way. And I think she was under pressure. I don't know about AIPAC because I didn't really report that story very closely, but I know from Republicans sent by the White House to sort of just do us a favor, get this out. Now, they were more concerned about the troop issue, and the Iran thing was secondary. But you've got people like Senator Jim Webb, for example, the new Democrat out of Virginia, who's really made this a huge issue. Like, he really is like, we've got to get this bill going, and I think this is going to be the next debate. I think you're right to tap into that. I think it's significant, and again, for me as a reporter, it's the kind of thing that I want to look at as, again, well, what role does Congress have? What role does Congress have in foreign policy making? Should they have this role? I mean, given what's happened in Iraq, should they? I mean, so they passed a resolution on Iraq and went to war, but is it the same set of circumstances on Iran? Is it different? And I think you will see that debate in the coming weeks. Yeah, go ahead. Last question, and then I'll stick around if anybody wants to talk to me.
Back to Iraq. I think like 3/4 of us in this room are writing a research paper for Timmy right now. So I have a question. What does Washington think about a federal Iraq with 3 autonomous Kurds, Sunnis, and Shia?
Oh my God, Joe Biden. Okay, so well, have they given them Les Gelb, Joe Biden's paper to read? I'll give it to them. Well, this is, it's even, Hillary Clinton said it's too late for that. If you look look up that New York, I have it here, I can give it to you, the New York Times thing. I don't know. I mean, they're not into it. I mean, they're not into splitting up Iraq. I mean, it would just create too many more problems with Turkey. I mean, we don't even talk about Turkey. You think everything's fine in the north. You got Turkey ready to invade northern Iraq right now, too. Like, and if Kurdistan declares itself officially independent, oh boy, we're in trouble. You think we got problems now? Then that whole area with all the oil up there and stuff. So I think there's a lot of skepticism, I would say, about the federal option. Now, Rice is toyed every once in a while with this idea of, let's keep it together, but, create more autonomy, that's basically what's happening de facto on the ground. But to formalize it as 3 independent states or partition or anything, that's, at this point, now that you have an elected government in Iraq, it's not feasible. They would have to come to that conclusion on their own. And a lot of experts would argue, I think, that Iraqi identity and nationalism, with everything that's going on, the Kurds aside maybe, but would want to hold this unit together somehow. I mean, the Shiites can't get it together in the south, for one, right? I mean, they're fighting amongst themselves, and how do you create a Shia stan down there or whatever, and Sunni stan? And, I mean, Kurdistan has been a success, and I mean, they are struggling with how they fit into this model. But from the Bush administration's perspective, partition is a no-go, I would say. Thanks for coming, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you all for staying. Janine is graciously offered to hang around a bit up here if you'd like to continue the conversation, and we look forward to your next visit to campus.
Yeah, me too.
When's your next visit?
טוב, יש עכשיו, אני אמרתי, אמרו לי פגישה אחת, זאתי באפור, תשאלי אותה אם היא קימבר, עם המשקפיים, אני חושבת שזאת קימבר, דברי איתה, שזה יהיה אחרי השיעור שלך. היי, I hope that was all right.
Thank you.